so that we could see what kind of person are you? What would you benefit more from, right? Low carb diets or a higher carb diet. And it's something that you would find more results and more progress on your dieting or fat loss journey, or essentially your health, by eating for understanding where your body's at, so you don't need to waste time and years trying to play around with higher carb or lower carb or higher fat and lower fat and different types of training stimulus just to see which one you most benefit from. You just know that off the bat. What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. I wanted to start this video off by talking about why I'm making it in the first place. And there's a lot of personalities, I would say, in the health and fitness space right now that advocate for, low carb diets, keto diets, things of that nature, and personalities on the other side of that spectrum that feel just as passionate and strong, that advocate for carbs, say you shouldn't be afraid of them, and we should honestly be eating more of them to help our performance, either, physical performance in the gym, mental performance, because they say that the brain runs primarily on glucose and carbs and etc. So I'm just thinking to myself, after listening to all these people constantly year after year with their newfound revolutionary carb diet, either the lack thereof or the implementation of more of it. And I'm thinking, how can both sides that have very strong evidence on either side to support their claims, but how can both sides of a spectrum be so right and so passionate about it when they're the complete opposites? So people over here on the low carb saying that, okay, this is what's going to make you healthier because of, insulin resistance, and it's going to help you with, mitigating type 2 diabetes risk. And then you have people that love carbs on this side that are talking about, well, you don't need to worry about that because there's just no way you can get that many carbs in your diet that'll do that, or you shouldn't at least be afraid of them. And there's some people that are like really push it far to, well, you store your carbs as glycogen in the muscle, and that's what's going to give you the energy. So if you're working out so much and you're more of like a strength athlete, you should be utilizing carbs because it won't be in your blood as much. Therefore, you won't have as much insulin resistance or diabetes because it'll be in your muscle and you'll be using it more. And it's so much information that it's like, which one do I listen to? Which, am I going to be a strength athlete or not? And, do I have to worry about type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance, or is that something that I don't need to worry about? And like, how many carbs is the right amount? And people honestly make it a competition where it's like, oh, I only ate this amount of carbs per day. I only ate 20 grams of carbs and therefore I'm healthy. And then people on the other side where it's like, oh, I need to get in my meals, so I need to eat in like 400 grams of carbs per day so I can actually function properly and gain some muscle and therefore be healthy because muscle is healthy. So definitely wanted to make this video just explaining why this dichotomy can happen and how, in my opinion, both sides of this argument, which are complete polar opposites, are both partially right. And not necessarily that either of them is wrong, just both partially right. And the reason for this is that it is, in my opinion, that it comes down to your genetics, and everybody is different. So when we're looking at the studies from either side, where each side is presenting these strong studies that back up their claims, and it's like, well, why did they find that statistical significance in their claim that would support them? And it's like, okay, well, there's only one main factor. If you find all the common denominators, there's only one factor that can really explain for such differences. And it's simply just genetics, right? Like that's what we're made up of. And, we're made up of the food we eat and all the macros and the certain percentages that we consume. But how does it get digested? And it really just comes down to all of the little enzymes that would break down that food and the efficiency at which those enzymes work. So if we're looking specifically at type 2 diabetes, it's a problem with your insulin levels, right? So insulin's not being in the blood, either lack thereof for type 1 diabetes, where your pancreas from the beta cells are not secreting insulin, therefore glucose is remaining high in your blood and you have high blood sugar. That's what type 1 diabetes is. And type 2 diabetes is just the fact that there's too much insulin secretion and you're not able to, at the target tissues, you become desensitized to all that insulin that's around. So those target tissue receptors don't mediate the proper effects of responding to that insulin, therefore not shoveling the glucose into those target tissues where they should be and remaining in the blood now. And again, resulting in high blood glucose levels. So if we're looking at insulin is a hormone, and all these little peptides and enzymes that are secreted and all that stuff, they have to be created somehow, right? Insulin has to come from somewhere. We have it in our bodies. How is it made? And it's made from our genes. It's made from gene transcription. That's how all proteins are made. That's how all structures essentially are made in the body, either through chemical bonding, like through spontaneous reaction, and those are just going to be your organic compounds. But if we're talking about hormones and we're talking about the signaling pathways of those hormones and the peptides that would signal them, those are created via your genetics. Those are created when these transcription factors bind your genome. They bind to those little chromosomes and your little genes, and then they transcribe it. They walk across the gene and they create a protein that would mediate some effect. So protein, if we want to think about it, in your body, the little proteins aren't just necessarily from like muscle building. We're talking about like biological proteins now, which can be like enzymes, which would break down your food and creating, enzymes or signaling peptides that would signal hormones to be secreted and whatnot. Like, how does your body know how to secrete insulin and when? Because there's these little peptides that would bind to that insulin or to that hormone receptor, essentially the gland that would secrete that hormone so that it could be released into the blood as a part of the endocrine system. That means like traveling throughout the blood to different target tissues, varying throughout the body. So how can it be that we have all of the same hormones, right? Assuming you're not type 1 diabetic. We have all the same hormones as everybody else, right? And some people have different amounts. How can that be? Again, it's from your genetics. And so this is the only common denominator which would be able to explain why some people find success eating a lower carb diet and why some people would still find success eating a higher carb diet. Like, it's all the same hormones that are being mediated. It's all the same reactions. It's all the same carbs, essentially. How can both sides be right? And how can you both find success doing whichever one? And I think that, again, it just boils down really to your genetics. So specifically looking at your genome, there is one particular gene in which would most strongly be associated with this insulin signaling that would either induce or, keep insulin resistance at bay. So either keeping your insulin sensitivity at bay, keeping all of the target tissue sensitive to insulin so that you don't become insulin resistant, and things that are pretty much the stimulus that would provide your body to mediate its efficiency in a proper way. So again, it's really just the stimulus behind, so like your genetic makeup, what you are made of, and then it's what you do with that makeup where you can optimize your carbohydrate control or your diet control or your training control or any sort of control that you want to regulate. It would be mediated by the stimulus of those genes and essentially be something that you can optimize via your own body's efficiency mechanisms, right? So there is one gene in the body, the TCF7L2 gene, previously known as the TCF4 gene. And when this is transcribed, it codes for a transcription factor for GLP-1, for glucose metabolism. And that's a lot of words. But essentially what that means is that there's a gene. It is the TCF7L2 gene. It's on chromosome 20. And all the cells in the body have this DNA. So all of your cells essentially have the capacity to transcribe this gene. And that means that it copies over this gene to create your little proteins that are able to function and do stuff in your body. And so this gene specifically, the TCF7L2 gene, it codes for a transcription factor, meaning the thing that would bind to the DNA. So there's this little molecule that would bind to that DNA sequence specifically that would code for GLP-1. And how you might be familiar with GLP-1, it's gotten a lot of popularity recently with drugs out there for sema and dulaglutides, such as Ozempic, Trulicity, and they've been sort of crowned as like these miracle fat loss drugs and given to a lot of patients with type 2 diabetes. And this would make sense because GLP-1 agonists, so those drugs are the agonists of the GLP-1 receptor, but GLP-1 itself it's going to act the same way as the drug, or rather the drug acts like this GLP-1 molecule, which binds to a receptor and then stimulates insulin to be secreted into the blood, right? So this goes back to the idea of like, how does the body know when to secrete insulin? It's like, okay, we eat carbohydrates, it enters our system, we start to digest it, but like, where does that connection come from? Like physical to the mental to the hormone releasing, and it's stimulated by GLP secretion, right? So GLP is made in the liver, the pancreas, and all that stuff during the digestive process, and then it goes over and stimulates insulin secretion. So when GLP levels are high, GLP-1 levels, specifically after eating, and specifically after eating glucose-rich foods, so carbohydrates, this is going to travel throughout the body, right? It's going to go to the places where it can bind to its receptors, the GLP-1 receptor, binds to that, and then it opens up a little portal for insulin to be released and secreted into the bloodstream. And so what insulin does then is it travels throughout the bloodstream, it goes to its target tissues, so like fat cells, muscle cells, the brain, etc., right? Target tissues, things in the body, organs and stuff. And it allows glucose to enter those tissues, so it gets it out of the blood. And remember, type 2 diabetes is the problem of keeping glucose in the blood. So insulin reduces those effects because it shovels all the glucose out of the blood and into target tissues. Now, that's what the gene is supposed to do. If there is a variant of this gene, the protein structure and thus its function, that is a central dogma of biology, the structure and the function would be changed. Therefore, if there is a mutation or a variant or a polymorphism, as if some people like to call it, if there's a change essentially in that gene transcription, in that gene, the TCF7L2 gene, then we won't be able to metabolize that glucose and put it into our target tissues. So looking at some data, there's about 30% of people on average, between like 20 to 30% of people across different races that would have a mutation in this gene. And they would have, it is a C to T allele transition. But essentially what this means is that when you're transcribing that gene, it doesn't transcribe specifically for the GLP-1 to act in the manner that it's supposed to act. So there's a slight dysfunction in it where it might not be able to bind to the specific receptors on the pancreas or the liver, wherever else insulin is going to get secreted from. So if there's a little change in that genome, there's a little change in that protein that comes from that gene, right? So in this case, specifically, if you change the structure or the transcription, if there's a mutation in the gene, the TCF7L2 gene, there's going to be a change in the structure of what's created from that gene, which is GLP-1. Then there's going to be a change in the structure of that GLP-1, which can't necessarily bind and induce all of the effects. And in this specific case, it won't be secreting as much insulin. And what does this mean now? If you're not secreting as much insulin now, then you're going to keep glucose in the blood because now there's not as much insulin going to those target tissues to take it out of the blood and shovel it into those target tissues. So if there's someone that has, and again, it's about 30% of people across different races, it varies between different races and whatnot, but essentially it varies between people. There's about a 20 to 30% chance that you might have this mutation in your genome where you're not able to metabolize glucose so readily. And 30% is quite a high amount, right? This is 3 in 10 people. So, or at least, 20 to 30 is 2 or 3 out of 10 people. So it is somewhat likely that you might have this specific mutation or polymorphism in your TCF7L2 gene that would inhibit your producibility, I guess, if that's a word, of GLP-1, which would then lower your insulin secretion into the blood, which would make you more likely to become type 2 diabetic. And therefore, you specifically would then need to watch out for your carbohydrate metabolism and your intake of carbohydrates, and specifically, looking at the glycemic index. So essentially, what is going to spike your insulin levels versus keep them more like even, not going to spike and crash as much, just keep it more level throughout the day. So if that's the case, you are going to be the type of person that would benefit more, right? So it's not something that you need specifically to do in order to see results, but it's something you should look out for. And it's something that you would find more results and more progress on your dieting or fat loss journey, or essentially your health journey, by, mitigating the risks of insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes by eating a lower carb diet. And I think this is where a lot of the people would end up seeing those results in these specific studies. It just so happened, and again, 20 to 30% of people, very likely a lot of those people are going to be included in a study, especially if it's a randomized controlled trial, right? On average, you're going to have 20 to 30% of people in those studies having this polymorphism or mutation or variant in that gene, therefore making it almost seem, but it is true, seem like a low carb diet is going to be beneficial, because for them, it is beneficial, right? But for the rest of people on this side, maybe those studies included a bunch of people, like again, 70% of people who don't have this mutation that are able to metabolize glucose well, so long as they don't overeat a ton of glucose and just go ham on it, eating cookies and ice cream because for the sake of, I don't have a mutation. Like, that's still going to be bad. But at least they don't need to specifically watch out and maybe not follow a keto or a low carb diet. They can still have their carbs and eat them too, right? And that's just their genetic makeup. That's just how their bodies are designed. So that's what would essentially allow these studies to prove or make it seem, but it is true statistically, that carbs aren't bad and that you shouldn't be afraid of them. So what's the solution to all of it? Again, I had mentioned before in the beginning of this video, I think that both sides are not wrong, but they're partially true in the way that they're accurate and they can be beneficial on either side for the people that they are beneficial, right? And before, it's a common conception that it's like, okay, you just chalk it up to your genetics. And it's like, yeah, you could chalk it up to your genetics, but we have the capacity now, as the human genome is essentially being finished, transcribed as a whole for most people, right? We have the capacity now with science and with technology to screen your genome so that we could see what kind of person are you? What would you benefit more from, right? Low carb diets or a higher carb diet. And, we can also screen for things like, okay, is your body more adapt to endurance training or strength training? So if you're more endurance training, again, a lower carb diet might be fine. If you're strength training, you might see more progress eating more carbs. It doesn't mean that you have to eat more carbs. It just would mean that you'd probably see more progress. It's a good stimulus. It's a good stepping stone for understanding where your body's at, so that you don't need to waste time and years trying to play around with higher carb or lower carb or higher fat and lower fat and different types of training stimulus just to see which one you most benefit from. You just know that off the bat and you can just see results quick. So I think this is important that people understand that, we all know we're made up of DNA. Like, we all just chalk it up. Oh, this is in my DNA. This is in my genetics. This is just who I am, right? But it's like, yeah, that is true. But now we have the capacity to understand what that actually means and how we can optimize that. So essentially, you can pretty much tell where you're at right now genetically, not to just give yourself an excuse to being like, oh, well, I can't eat carbs, so that's just the way my metabolism is, just because of my genetics. It's like, no, that might be true, but we can use different tweaks and different diets and different controls with like the glycemic index or certain types of diet or lifestyle practices that would help optimize what's right for you, right? So there's no point in eating a higher carb diet and then getting mad when that doesn't work. It's just because your genome doesn't really support that. So it doesn't mean that you can't lose weight. It just means that you're not doing the right things to lose weight. And this is going to eliminate a lot of those time and the practices over the course of years that you would have to have trial and error and almost suffer through because nothing's working, it seems like. Well, now we know what will work, and then we just have to do it, right? So I just wanted to bring that to light. I think This is something that could be very beneficial for everyone in their health and fitness journey if they know what a good starting point is for them based on their personal genetic makeup. Like, why would we all want to subscribe to one general practice, like one low carb diet or one high carb diet? Like, everybody should be doing this, quote unquote. And it's like, no, if your genome doesn't support that, why would you be doing that? You're not going to see results. And then a lot of those coaches will, oh, you just didn't follow it. You just, you didn't really try as hard as you should have. And it's like, no, you could have been trying hard, which in some cases they're right. A lot of the times people really don't follow it and try hard. And you can certainly find success doing any sort of diet, right? But the best diet or the best lifestyle is going to be the one that's right for you. And how do we know which one is right for you? There's two ways of looking at it. You can try through years and years of trial and error, or we can look at your genetics and tell right off the bat so you can see progress immediately. I don't know about you, but I'll take the latter. So, hope you guys like this video. If you guys want to check out more on the TCF7L2 gene specifically and how it works and what different types of polymorphisms that are included in this, there's a specific study that talks about, specific to women versus men and how there's different diabetes risks there. I can link a good site down below. If you want to work with me, email me. We do all of this genetic testing through a verified third party, and we can also set you up with great coaches that once you get your genome and we go through it with you so that you understand how your body will function at a proper level, we can connect you to great coaches that will hold you accountable, give you motivation, and make sure that it's really the implementation of the genetic lifestyle suggestions that we give that you can actually see results. So it's one thing to know the results and how they're going to work. It's another thing to actually do them. If you want to have the best of worlds, the best of both worlds. Wow, I said that backwards. If you want the best of both worlds, email me down below. It's at andrewridzik@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Instagram at andrewridzik, and I will see you guys in the next one.